Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast, and today I ask a troubling question. Has slavery ever really left us? Are we still living with its legacy? Certainly we are in some respects, but maybe not as much as people think, or that we should really kind of revisit what its legacy is. Imagine for a moment that you are a child growing up in the antebellum South. And you're surrounded by slaves working either in the household or in the fields. And you have a natural empathy. I mean, all humans do. And you see how these people are treated differently. You actually get to know them. They take care of you. They speak with you. And what does it take for you to be able to reconcile the fact that they're treated so badly and that you're treated so well? And that the people that are around you are treated so well. This is a really fundamental thing that has gone on, of course, for all of human history, but I think it's something that modern people don't really appreciate as much, is that the child's empathy had to be crushed at some point in order to be able to live with themselves. And that's true for all people. Anyone who's a little bit older, who remembers what it was like in the time of civil rights in 60s and 70s can even testify to this, because we were objectively more racist back then, and people spoke more racially back then. And a lot of people really did have their empathy crushed. And it still goes on today. So it still drives a lot of Christian thought today, much more than we realize. And it makes it so that it's difficult for us to face some of the problems that we have and some of the things that we need to get over in order to be able to move forward as a church. So the real question has to start with, and there are different ways of dealing with this, I should say. You really have to discuss, what was slavery in Scripture? Was it different? And how do we manage that, especially because Scripture guides our lives, we believe. So we start with Leviticus 25, 42 through 46, which is really the center of the Torah and how it talks about slavery. And it starts with verse 42 from Leviticus 25. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves are sold. So this is talking about Israelites. You shall not rule over them with harshness, but you shall fear your God. As for the male and female slaves, whom you may have, it is from the nations around you that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also acquire them from among aliens residing with you, and from their families who are with you, who have been born in your land. They may be your property. And this is really important, verse 46. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property. These you may treat as slaves. But as for your fellow Israelites, no one shall rule over the other with harshness. This is clearly chattel slavery. And you could say that it's race-based slavery, even though the concept of race really didn't exist back then like it does, or it has in our eras. But the idea of foreigners can be subject to chattel slavery and perpetual slavery is, very, very clear here. The earlier part of this chapter talks about the Jubilee, and this is when you had slaves and you had debts that people had. Indentured servitude, this idea of, debt slaves, was common throughout history, and certainly was in this era as well. And Israel was never just one nation. It was always tribes, and there were always the different tribes competing with each other and so forth. And there were slaves between the tribes. There was always battles between the tribes and so forth, and there were people who had debts that became slaves. The Jubilee year was for them, and only for them, and that was to settle scores, settle debts every 50 years or so, and was a way of keeping social order between the tribes. But you notice they make it very, very clear that those rules are only for Israelites, that any slave that was outside of that system of those tribes could be kept in perpetuity. And their children, they could be bred, and their children could be then kept in forever and could be sold. Families could be separated. All of this is exactly what we had in America, right? Is that African slaves and indigenous slaves, but certainly African slaves, who were very distinguishable racially, which they didn't have in these cultures, you could immediately say, oh, well, if that's a black person in the Americas, most likely that person is a slave, and that they were never to be freed, or they were only to be freed under certain circumstances. But the default is that they would have children, and those children would become slaves as well, and then they were basically property. And it says right here in Leviticus 25, it says, for them to inherit as property. So these people were owned. Now, so when anybody ever comes and says, oh, well, the Bible was different about slavery than American slavery, that's just not true. And these verses were absolutely used by slaveholders and pro-slavery people throughout American history, and were used as a way of governing it. And you say, well, slavery wasn't part of the kingdom of God or the ideas of God, and there's just nothing to say that it wasn't in the Old Testament. Now, of course, over time, and especially with the New Covenant and with Christianity, also in Judaism, but more in Christianity, is over time people became more uneasy about slavery. But quickly when it became to economic purposes, and became, as soon as Christianity becomes imperial and part of the state, well, it just falls right back in. Slaves were very much part of the early church. These household churches, which was basically Christianity at the time. Slavery was, the slaves actually participated more in the church than in other circumstances. But it was very complicated, but it was still slavery. It was still owning people and holding them against their will. So by the time we get to Colossians and Ephesians both have household codes in them. It looks like maybe they were copied because some of the language is like really overlapping. But it's very clear, especially in Colossians 3:22, where it says, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, not with a slavery performed merely for looks to please people, but wholeheartedly, fearing the Lord. So this is talking to slaves saying, you better be a good slave, be submissive, obey in everything your master. So you can see, obviously, Colossians 3:22 was a very big favorite in most of American history, especially among people who held slaves. Whatever task you do, work as if your soul depends on it, as for the Lord and not for humans, since you know that from the Lord you will receive inheritance as your reward. So in other words, a payback, a future payback in heaven, presumably, and serve the Lord Jesus. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for whatever wrong has been done, and there is no partiality. And then finally, this is chapter 4, verse 1 of Colossians. Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, for that you know that you also have a master in heaven. So in other words, equating the relationship of the slaveholder with God to the slave with the master. So this is, obviously was a very popular verse in American slavery as well. So we just need to get rid of this idea once and for all that the Bible does not condone slavery. Of course it does. It does. It's within the system. You could say that, and there are many speakers who talk about this, is that's clearly, Paul was looking for ways to develop equivalency with slaves. There is no free or slave, no Greek or Jew, no woman or man, this kind of discussion. But it's such an embedded part of society. Something like 30% of the Roman Empire, as far as we know, were slaves. And, more than the United States ever had. Although if you were to go to certain parts of the South in the antebellum period, that it was higher than that. There were more slaves than there were non-free or free people. But in the larger society, in the United States, it really never was more than 10 to 15% of total people who were slaves. But the thing is that the equivalents are there, and that it was so much an embedded part of society during the times of the Bible, and really for almost all of human history up until the recent centuries, that slavery was just there. And so the Bible clearly has it in there, clearly has chattel slavery and debt slavery. So we just have to get rid of that. The reason why people ignore this, and the reason why people say things like, oh, well, slavery was different in the Bible, is they're trying to uphold the inerrancy of the Bible and saying, look, the Bible is perfect. Instead of just being a reflection of what the societies were. That's number one. Number two, it's to deny the fact that we change. Our relationship with God and our understanding of God changes over time. Most Christians today, all but a very small fringe of Christians today, believe that slavery is a sin and that slavery is not in the character of God. But that is a very recent, that is only in the last couple hundred years of Christian history that people think that way. But, are we going to say then, well, were those people, wrong, or is that maybe slavery really wasn't the same? That's nonsense. It's total nonsense. It's the fact that as we have become freer and as we have learned different ways of dealing with each other, that we have integrated that into our understanding of the nature of God. We don't believe that women should be forced into marriage like they used to be. Even, now there's a fringe of people even today that feel that women should be forced into those relationships. But, that's a very minority view. But, 200 years ago, it was the norm. So we really have to break this idea that we are the same as they were, had to live in that society. It should be the same, and that a godly society or godly people today really need to look back. I've talked about this quite a bit in some of my short videos and in my ministry, talking about phony originalism. So I'm thinking about making a podcast episode on phony originalism. It's a big part of Christianity that we need to get away from. So let's back out of this a little bit about that. I think it's just absolutely crystal clear that the Bible does condone slavery, that the slavery that was talked about in the Bible is the same as American slavery was. And that as, basically holding anybody against their will or owning people. You could even say it's the same as people who are trafficked today. There are slaves in the world today. And we have to recognize that. So let's talk a little bit about how do we deal with that history. Now, there are studies that show that if medical students receive training very early in their career, in medical school, very beginning, if they receive training on how Black people in America are treated by the healthcare system, that there are better outcomes for that med student, and especially when they become doctors, is that their ability to deal with patients that are different than them racially, for example, or to deal with patients that are not in the majority, is far better. And you wonder, well, what is this? Is this just awareness? Partly, but it's true for white medical students, certainly, but it's also true for Black medical students, for Hispanic medical students, for all races, all different backgrounds of medical students, is that when they see how Black people are treated by the medical establishment, it helps them understand that there are systemic issues built into our society, and that really helps them. And the outcomes are better. So now I know that this is a very unpopular thing today. We have DEI initiatives under attack. We have anything that's, quote, woke under attack. But the thing is that this has just been studied to the hilt, and that it needs to be done. This is also true for seminary students, and for people in the ministry as well. Now, of course, in the ministry, it's quite different because you have lots of baggage of history, and you have a lot of baggage of how people have used the scriptures in the past, and then we bring all of that with us, right? But one of the things that really, there are two books that I believe that every seminary student, anybody who's considering entering the ministry, really should read very early on. One is called Divided by Faith: Evangelical Faith and the Problem of Race in America. This is by Christian Smith and Michael O. Emerson. And this is basically was a big study that they did on how race has been used by the church, how people have split themselves racially in churches, how they interact. And it's kind of a depressing read. It's a very hard read. It really tells you a lot about American history in a way that most people never get. Because if you look at American history from a religious point of view, it kind of opens up to you for people, because so many people throughout American history and even today still identify themselves as Christians or as religious people in general. The next one is called The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. This is also not so religiously focused, although it does talk about religion, but the idea that you can just see how people's minds have been. When you're a fish, I like to say, when you're a fish, you don't know you're wet, right? When you're a person in the United States, you don't know how much you're swimming in the waters of racial division. And that's what Jamar Tisby's book does a great job of. So both of these, I think, are really good in that you can kind of get this idea that, yeah, we really are this way. If you spend any time outside of the United States, or you spend any time in situations where there's lots of interaction with the system, or you see how the system, how you see how the medical establishment, the police, how government works with people of different races, you really start going, yeah, now I understand better. For me personally, that was doing CPE, being a chaplain intern. I did see a lot of that. I kind of butted up against that a little bit. Being in the Pacific Northwest, there aren't as many interactions with other racial groups in the Pacific Northwest as in other parts of the country. So it's really important for ministers and anybody who's really working with the public to do that. But it's really, I think that once you see that sort of outside the establishment view, then it's really helpful for people. So you can call that woke, or you can call that DEI or whatever. And there are ways in which that's done very badly, but at least you have to give people an opportunity to see, and that's very helpful. One of the things that was kind of illuminates this in a great way, especially in a sort of in the South, and in how with the history that's there, is just in the last few weeks, the Nottoway plantation was burned down. Now, this was the largest plantation house, I think, built ever, and it was for a Virginia planter who moved to Louisiana in the 1850s in order to move from cotton to sugar, and then found that because sugar was a crop that was booming at the time. And he built this plantation, and it's about halfway between New Orleans and Baton Rouge along the Mississippi River. A couple of weeks ago, the plantation burned down, and the reaction was very interesting, because people were celebrating. Mostly black people were kind of like, finally. And you go, well, why is that? Why is that such it seems something that's so long ago and so forth? Well, the reason why was that this plantation kind of shows, and how it was used, kind of shows the racial blindness that still exists in America, especially in this region. This plantation, Nottoway, you can still see it on the website. I don't, as of the time of this recording, the website's still up, even though the plantation's gone. And it was a place that you could go and rent rooms. It was a luxury resort and wedding venue. So people would go there. They'd have big parties. You could have gourmet meals. You'd stay in these absolutely beautiful rooms. The house is beautiful. There's all this stuff on the website about these trees and these ancient trees, and these live oak trees, and how important they were and how beautiful they are, and they're all named. There's not a word about slavery anywhere on their website. What kind of person, think about this, what kind of person rents this out as a wedding venue, and how beautiful it is? Well, obviously they do it because of the beauty of the place, without any acknowledgement whatsoever that this was a place of rape, murder, torture, that at the time of the end of the Civil War, or time of emancipation, there were still 155 slaves working there. There were people there was family separation was the norm. Beatings were the norm. Poor food. The only reason why they fed the slaves was, to make sure that they could work, but they didn't really care for them at all. And that wasn't just the field hands, that was also the people working in the house. So you'd say, well, maybe people who were domestic slaves were treated a little bit better. Yeah, they were perhaps dressed better and fed better and so forth, and they did interact, but they also were subject just to this daily grind of having to work with the slave owners' family, and their guests, and just being reminded on a daily basis of their inferiority or their lack of humanity. So, but no matter what their station in life, whether, from the lowest to the highest slave, they were all just treated horribly. and it's hidden, and that's part of it. So when this house burns down, it's not so much that we should erase history or anything like that. It's just that it's the same as other monuments or other things that point to slavery in the South, is that it's because of how it's used. So people have complained a lot about, monuments being taken down, for example, in the South, well, or anywhere in the nation. Well, it's because those monuments aren't reflective of the truth. Many of them came much later, came from the Daughters of the Confederacy in the early 20th century and things like that. We're part of Jim Crow and so forth. So, I think of Stone Mountain. If you've ever been to Stone Mountain, which is just a little bit east of the city of Atlanta, it's a beautiful park area. It's this amazing geographic feature of stone that's a few hundred feet high. It's just an amazing place. And in the mid 60s, they came and they they carved Confederate generals into the thing. This stone was and that was a double atrocity, really, because this stone was sacred to the Native American people that were there. There was a prayer site. Now, of course, the Native American people were moved out of there, more than a century ago, so they really didn't have a say. And then they take this beautiful geographic feature and they turn it into a memorial to a fake history and to and the lost cause, and to memorialize people who don't deserve to be memorialized, honestly. And so even today, so they've made some changes to it, but even today, you go there and it's not honest. It's not an honest depiction of what's going on. So this is really a big part of where we need to talk about slavery. Just like saying that the Bible doesn't talk about slavery, for example, or the African or the American slavery of Africans is different than what happened in the Bible, and and all of that. You just have to realize, no, bad is bad, evil is evil, slavery is evil. Let's just label that and realize that and be honest about it. Be honest about what happened there. There are plantations. There's a plantation near New Orleans that does a great job of showing what real life is like as slaves. And it's treated almost like a concentration camp is in Europe, where it's basically a memorial to the enslaved people. And that's good. That's what we should be doing with these sites. I've been to Monticello, and that's sort of a mixed bag. It's mostly about how great Jefferson was, but Monticello has done a decent job. Probably needs to do more, but it has done a decent job to recognize how slaves were treated and how they were exploited by Jefferson, and also by other white plantation owners in Virginia at the time. So again, that's what we really need to do, is acknowledge the truth and move forward. We need to do that as part of our history as Christians too. The Presbyterian Church is a good indicator of this, because the history of the Presbyterian Church is messy. Presbyterian Church, along with the Episcopalians, were really the sort of the upper echelons of early American society. It's where the kind of the rich people hung out, right? The establishment. And that's still true. Presbyterian Church has a long history of being sort of establishment white. Before the Civil War, or around the Civil War, the Presbyterian Church split in half. And the Presbyterian Church of the United States became the Southern Church, and the United Presbyterian Church became the Northern Church of the Presbyterians. Now, there are a lot of little splinters and things like that have gone on. since then. But that was the big schism in the church at the time. It must always be remembered also, and I tell this to my fellow Presbyterians, is that the Presbyterian Church has never been in the lead, was never in the lead for things like abolition, for women's rights, for any of those things. That really was more the holiness movement that was much more active. In fact, one of the key figures in the abolition movement and in the early 19th century, Charles Finney, was a Presbyterian. He had to basically leave the church. He was kind of kicked out of the church as a minister because he was considered more radical on these issues. Today we wouldn't see him as a radical, but he really, needed to ally himself more with the Second Great Awakening, the holiness movement. So I'm talking about, Methodists and, Quakers and people like that who were really pushing for social change in the early 19th century. So anyway, so you have the Presbyterians, and when they split, we came back together in 1983. Now, another split that happened in the church as well is between the modernists and the fundamentalists. And that's kind of a rough thing, but more of the people who were more fundamentalist, and I always say these are not really necessarily conservatives. I don't like to use that term, but these are people who believe that the Westminster Confession is the end of the confessions, and that we really shouldn't reform theologically beyond the Westminster Confession. That would be the Presbyterian Church in America. And that's the southern version of it. There is a northern version called the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And like I said, there's other splinter groups of that. But you look at today, and you could say, and there is about as much racial diversity in these more conservative fundamentalist churches than there is in the PCUSA, which is the PCUSA is the new United Church since 1983, when the United Presbyterians and the Presbyterian Church in the United States came together and created the PCUSA in 1983. But it's very interesting. A lot of the struggles that the PCUSA has had in the last 40 years has been, how much do we modernize? How much do we move forward? How much do we take the ideas that came out of, say, the Confession of 1967, which contains lots of language about racial reconciliation as a theology, and move forward with that? In recent years, in the last 25, 30 years, a lot of it's been about LGBTQ people and whether we include them in the church and leadership of the church. And people kind of over-focus on that because it's really part of the big theme. It's not just LGBTQ people, but it's also about racial minorities in the church, about people who are more, have different theologies. They're still Trinitarian, they're still part of the church, but they aren't necessarily completely conforming to the, or the Eurocentric, white, masculine white ideals of the Westminster Confession, and are moving beyond that. Now, when we talk about the PCA and we talk about the OPC, they are firmly against any kind of move in this direction, even though their racial makeup is not much different. It's just that, how do you reform? Do you continue to reform? So that's where I think that the PCUSA you see so much about racial reconciliation. You can see that in the leadership of the PCUSA in the last couple General Assemblies and so forth. You see a lot more of what we would consider this kind of woke agenda. And again, I don't like to use the word woke because it's loaded, but this idea of moving beyond this. This is why we're doing it. We've kind of, with especially with the adoption of the Belhar Confession, which is out of South Africa, talks a lot about reconciliation, especially over race. Once that was adopted in 2016, we've kind of crossed the Rubicon. There's no going back. And this has been hard for a lot of people, but it's important. If there's going to be a future, if there is a future, and I believe there is a good future for the Presbyterian Church, this is where we need to go. Because it's about acknowledgement. The church now has to deal much more with its past regarding Native American people, boarding schools and that kind of thing too. But once we have a culture in the church of dealing with that, of not trying to whitewash history, of not playing this game that the Bible was different or talked about slavery different than what we have today, then we can move on. And that's what I'm committed to, and I believe that the church is finally getting to the point where it's committed to that too. So is slavery still with us? Yes, because we're still carrying that load. We're kind of coded a lot, especially with the political environment right now, with all the discussion about things like DEI and woke and other things like that. We're kind of going into our camps again, and most of the people who are really against these initiatives are just denying that there's a problem. And many of the people that are for these initiatives are saying that, well, the other side's demonizing or whatever, or they're conflating it with liberal policies and things like that. You can't do that. We have to be clear-eyed about it and understand that the big tent of the church has to include people of all different kinds. But the one thing that we need to agree on is the fact that we have to be honest about the past. And we have to be honest about how do we move beyond our colonialist, racist, slavery-based past. And where do we go from here? And I think that that's really the key question in the church right now. And the key reform that we have to do right now is we have to be able to be honest about where we've come from and where we're going to. So with that, I'll say there's lots of things in the Bible, especially about slavery, racism, colonialism, all of these things that aren't really there. We have to be honest about that. And we need to come together. I really hope that that's what we can do in the next couple of decades as some of these older ideas do go away, as we're reckoning with a lot of the racial division that we still have today. At least we're talking about it. That's better than the past. At least we're reckoning with it. I hope there's a good result in that. Let's bring that together and let's do what we can to make it so that our churches are aware of that and moving together as well. So that with that, I say, God bless you.